Well, I'm excited to be with you all today. I would like to, while I don't have the attendee list in front of me, I would like to think that there's a good handful of you that I've met in the past along the way to introduce a little bit of my personal story. So I tell people to know me is to know I am an education reformer by choice. I am an entrepreneur by necessity. And my passion has been the future of education. How do we change things? And I trace it back to all the way when I was in high school, sitting for the ACT Saturday morning, 10 a.m., looking around at the hundreds of students crammed into the gymnasium, taking that 3.5 hour test, and couldn't believe that that was in reality how the best we had come up with to sort everyone in and out of their futures. And it just disturbed me that these 3.5 hours were going to determine so much of me and everyone else around me, our future. And so I started studying about high stakes testing and slowly had an epiphany that the books that began to study were the first thing I had ever really studied that a teacher hadn't assigned to me. And this was all right as I'm graduating from high school and realized I had become a great student and a terrible learner. And I committed to myself right then and there. I was going to be a great lifelong learner from there forward. And I've spent the rest of my adult life learning about education, learning about the history of education, learning about alternative models of education. And it just became this snowball, this passion, this obsession, and it's driven the entirety of my adult life. I'm here to talk to you all today as CEO of LearnIn, but before this, I helped to launch a university. I'm the founder of Degreed. I've written on the topic. I am a advisor to McKinsey in their future of work practice. So it really has afforded me the opportunity to meet a lot of you and to see so much of the world in these the challenges and problems that we're facing. Now, before I get into the presentation, one last thought, which is the world has changed. And I really do believe this conversation is important. This group of people is important because in our history, in the rear view mirror, we actually used to learn more of the majority of our learning in our lifetime came from teachers, from universities, from professors. But going forward in a model where we learn in more formal and structured ways over the entirety of our lives, we actually are beginning to learn more administered to us by our company, by HR, by L&D. That has the lines have crossed to where now we will learn more administered to us by L&D than we will by our teachers. And so that's important. The majority of our learning is now lifelong learning. And we've got to start to ask questions and examine and make sure we get it right so we don't encounter some unintended consequences that we're going to talk about. But first, let me tell you another little story. So, not sure if any of you are familiar with the ATT Workforce 2020 initiative. It was about a just shy of 5-year initiative, 4.5-year initiative done by AT&T. One of the most progressive, one of the most innovative, one of the largest scale corporate upskilling initiatives ever undertaken. And truly one of the most progressive. They were the first corporate sponsor with Udacity. They were a partner in standing up the first MOOC degree with Georgia Tech. They did some very cutting edge, very innovative, very progressive things as a part of this initiative. And the CEO of AT&T, Randall Stephenson, was quoted in the New York Times at the front of this initiative. And he said, if you're not learning 5 to 10 hours per week, you will become obsolete to us. And I used to take that quote and hold it up as this champion, Randall Stephenson, as this champion of lifelong learner. He gets it. We all have to take our own learning into our own hands. That's the new reality. Here he is. He's out there championing it. He's raising the banner. And I really held it up as this aspirational quote. Well, I was asked in, right, I think it was at the end of 2019. It was a little bit before COVID. I was asked to come and present to Harvard Business School a case study on the AT&T Workforce 2020 initiative. Now, I didn't write the case study, but given my background, I was tapped to come and present a case study to a Harvard Business School class. And so as I read through the study, I encountered something at the very back of the case study that kind of set off a bit of an alarm in my head. And that was, they had spent tens of millions of dollars as part of this workforce initiative, but they had given zero time. The entire initiative was conducted with the expectation that the employees, they can opt in, but those who do, they are participating on their own time at home. And so now as we talk about unintended consequences, again, this was one of the most progressive, the most ambitious. They funded this. This was, by all accounts, such a forward upskilling initiative. One of the biggest, one of the most innovative ever. But they gave zero time. Now, here are the unintended consequences of that action, which is, while we all have 24 hours in our day, we don't all have the same level of discretion over our time. And so who was able to opt in? Who was able to participate? Well, here, who wasn't? Anyone with a long commute, anyone with a second job, anyone who was a caretaker of elderly parents, anyone who was a single parent, those who didn't have good internet connectivity at home. Sort of the list goes on. Who was able to participate? Well, it ends up being the most educated tend to participate at higher rates. Men tend to participate at higher rates. Those who have a stay-at-home partner or spouse tend to participate at highest rates. And what that ended up indexing to was married white men with stay-at-home spouses were heavily over-indexed in their participation, and everyone else was under-indexed in their participation. So this 4.5-year agenda, over more than half of the company participated in the 4.5 years, it became this wedge inside the organization, sort of enabling, accelerating, upskilling married white men with stay-at-home spouses up and through the organization, and under-indexing on everyone else. An unintended consequence. Now, we're going to talk about kind of the harsh reality of where we are in workforce training. There are going to be winners and losers. This is a harsh environment and context in which we're operating. And we've got to see it clearly so that, again, we can confront the externalities, the consequences, and so we can avoid unintended consequences inside of our organizations. Right now, 2.2 more job openings than there are unemployed workers. 4 in 10 employees are at flight risk, the Great Resignation. 1 in 7 jobs are now remote. That was 1 in 67 pre-pandemic. And if you start to translate that into financial costs for an organization, so we are seeing a lot of organizations with as much as 40% annual attrition now in this Great Resignation environment. On a 1,000 person workforce, that's a $24 million financial loss annually. You know, if you're experiencing right now, what is that number inside your organization? 20% attrition, 30% attrition? If you're like many of the organizations I've been talking to, so per 1,000 people, that might be 12 million, that might be 18 million, but is it a substantial financial cost? There are winners, there are losers in this environment. Now, there is a bit of a silver lining that we're going to draw out. When it comes to the macro, I really am not an optimist, but there is a silver lining to it. Here is our reality. So this comes really from the work of Thomas Friedman, which kind of inspired this framework. He lays out in his book, Thank You for Being Late. And in particular, he identifies the year 2007 as when these lines crossed. We now exist in a world in which the rate at which technology scales has outpaced the rate at which humanity can learn. Now, this has never been encountered before. I actually believe when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, it's a misnomer. The industrial revolutions, the prior industrial revolutions, were a moment in time in which the rate of technological advancement outpaced the rate at which humanity could adjust and adapt and learn. But that's not what we're experiencing. The distinction being the rate not of advancement, but of scale. The rate at which technology can now scale globally has outpaced the rate at which humanity can learn. And right now, we have no expectation that that will close. We have no expectation. We have no line of sight. That the skills gap is getting bigger every day, every week, every month, every year. It is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we have no expectation that it will close. Now, the silver lining is in that macro environment, in that context, the silver lining is this, that the premium on learning and upskilling is going up and up and up and up as the skills gap is getting bigger. So that means any individual, any organization, any company, any government, any state that is willing to invest in upskilling, the return on it, the premium on it is going up and up and up and up. Now, as we talk about unintended consequences, as we talk about the consequences, the context of this environment, it's an environment where the skilled will become ever more skilled. The haves will have more, the have-nots will have less. And it is imperative that we do all that we can to bring people across the skills gap at scale, in mass. Those who are left behind, the gap is getting ever wider, ever bigger. And we won't be able to do this. Going back to what I said at the beginning, we're now in an environment where the majority of our learning is administered to us by HR, by L&D, by our company. We won't be able to make any meaningful impact in this equation without getting corporate learning right. So let me ask you all a question. This is the imperative. On average, what is the rate at which the average company is upskilling its employees? And I would actually get a number in your head. This is a bit, unfortunately, a bit shocking. The answer is the average company is upskilling the average employee at the rate of 4 skills per every 100 years. 1 skill per every 24 years. And this is the math. The average amount of time required to upskill by HBR is on average 480 hours. The average amount of time that companies are giving to employees to learn is on average 24 minutes per week. You do the math, it is 24 years to gain a skill at that rate. And when you look to the dollars, it's uncanny in that it is very similar. They both round to 24. The actual math slightly different. The average cost to upskill an employee per the World Economic Forum is $24,800 US. The average L&D spend per employee per year is roughly $1,100. You do the math, and it is 24 years at that rate to give one employee 1 skill. We are massively under-indexed. We are operating at a fraction of the scale that we must. McKinsey recently published new data. This is about 3.5 weeks old. This is surveying the American workforce. It is now 1 in 2 employees says they feel at risk in their career, in their work, if they don't gain new skills within the next 18 months. About 1.5 years ago, that number was 90 million. It's now about 110 million Americans. That is half of our workforce feels at fear of displacement without upskilling within the next 1.5 years. We are operating right now in America, we are upskilling 9 million Americans. We are operating at a fraction of the scale we need to be operating at. And it's in that environment, people are feeling it. Organizations are feeling it, people are feeling it. The worker is feeling it. And so you begin to see this reflected. You see it reflected in a lot of ways. The PwC annual CEO survey, it's a top 3 CEO concern. It's a top 3 threat to businesses globally, as identified by PwC and CEOs globally. The CEOs are feeling it. L&D sees it. HR sees it. The employee sees it. What do people want? Well, in that macro environment, what people want, what they need to feel secure, to feel like they have a future, is skills. So 73% are now more willing to work at a company that provides upskilling. 76 feel that upskilling offers them job security. And upskilled workers are 13% more positive. Workers are 13 more positive employers who support upskilling. And for the next generation, upskilling is now the 3rd most important benefit behind healthcare and disability. Now, that all sounds great. We all know, we're all feeling it. We need to upskill. But now we have to confront kind of, well, why aren't we upskilling at higher rates? What is the impediments? What are the barriers? We've got to start talking about that if we're going to make progress. Well, this is some of it. Look, going back to Randall Stephenson, spent tens of millions of dollars on the ATT Workforce 2020 initiative, but provided no time. Workers' interest in employer-provided upskilling, you see that if it's unpaid, it goes dramatically down. If it's paid, it goes dramatically up. If it is outside of work, it's still about half. It's not nothing. But if it's during work, it goes up. Now, I'm going to do a little bit more research before I kind of draw the conclusions from this. But so we look at this next one. This is from Gallup teamed up with Amazon to do this research. It got published earlier in the years. It's now, I don't know, about 3 or 4, maybe 5 months old, this research. But all right, the effect of upskilling on income. If you both self-initiate and your employer provided upskilling, you do see some positive effect on income. But then come down these lines. If it's employer provided, strictly employer provided, it only has a positive income on effect if it was paid time during work hours. That is it. Look at the other 3 lines. If it was paid time but outside of work hours, if it was unpaid during work hours, and unpaid outside of work hours, it actually has a negative correlation and impact on income. And we have to begin to confront this. The AT&T Workforce 2020 initiative, it's not good enough. For everything incredible to be said about it, it's not good enough. We can't get to where we need to go. We can't collectively get there in an egalitarian way with equity if we aren't willing to begin to confront this has to be done to reach scale, paid, and on the job. Both have to begin to be unlocked if we're going to get to where we need to go. All right, as you look at this, the top 5 priorities for HR leaders in 2022, building critical skills, design org, leadership, future of work, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Everyone's seeing it, everyone's feeling it. But how do we get there? How do we get building the critical skills right? We're going to talk about what's going on in the market. What are our solutions? What are our levers? Well, the market, the good news is the market's feeling this. The entrepreneurs, the companies, the vendors, the technology providers, the market is also responding. It's feeling this, it's seeing this, and the market is beginning to mature. Now, I want to draw out an important distinction, which is what really the last 10 years, the market has oriented to solving the knowledge problem. Truly, the last 10 years was this Cambrian explosion of content and the accessibility of knowledge. And that is itself a huge advancement and shouldn't be, it was requisite but not sufficient. It was a huge building block on the pathway to the future and to where we need to go. What is the difference when we talk about knowledge versus skills? Well, watching a YouTube video on marathon training does not turn you into a marathon runner. We all know that. Watching a CrossFit video does not turn you into a CrossFit athlete. Watching these videos does impart a level of knowledge to you, but actually becoming an athlete is a much bigger, harder journey. And so on the right, you have your 12-week marathon training plan. That includes the application, grinding it out, running, putting in the hours, putting in the distance, the nutrition, the application, the strategy of marathon, when to sprint, when to conserve your energy. Being good at marathons is a much more complex problem. Now, it's natural that the market would orient this way. We solved knowledge first. The last 10 years, Coursera, Udacity, Udemy, Pluralsight, lynda.com turning into LinkedIn Learning. Behind that, we had Codecademy and Khan Academy. We had the explosion of on-demand resources, articles, videos, books, podcasts. It was that Degreed and founding Degreed. That's what we were responding to, was this expansion of content and knowledge dissemination. And now the market is maturing into the harder problem, the much harder problem of actually upskilling, actually turning all of us into athletes. Now, Josh Bersin has been calling this out for a little while now. This comes from his work. I think he first published this in about 2019. So he's been kind of calling this shot for a couple of years now. But as you look at the evolution, the maturity of the market, the 2000s really were about the LMS, SCORM compliant, the hosting of these e-learning, the emergence of Classroom, to the first wave of it coming online, typically as PowerPoints, typically as non-interactive video. In 2010, you get this Cambrian explosion of the content libraries on demand, as I mentioned, Coursera, Udacity, edX, Pluralsight, Udemy, et cetera, et cetera. And the emergence of the LXP, the learning experience platform. Our learning used to be in corporate systems, and then in the 2010s, the internet, it exploded, and all of a sudden, if we needed to learn something, we went to Google. So our learning exploded out into the wild, and we needed to organize it. We needed to curate it. We needed to be able to make sense of it. And that solved the knowledge problem. On-demand, asynchronous, single player, anyone can learn anything on their own time. But now the future, what is the future? Well, the future is that upskilling. What are we going to call that? That is being called talent academies. Now, some organizations have been building academies for 5, 6, 8 years, a few maybe before that, but even the most progressive, innovative companies I've talked to came to their academies inside the last maybe 5 to 6 years. Really do believe that this is the next evolution in what we have to do as an industry. This is how we are going to build up the upskilling of our people and our organization. So, there's a win-win-win in all of this. Upskilling is massively ROI positive, massively ROI positive. So why aren't we doing more of it? We've got to unlock it. We've got to identify the barriers. What is it workers need? What is it the company needs? How do you align these interests? Workers want deep, intensive programs that can be put into practice sooner. Companies need a more dynamic way of meeting the shifting skill demands. This next bit of research I also find terribly fascinating. This one, interpreting this slide takes just a little bit more time. But this is work that Degreed partnered with Harvard Business Review to do. And it reflects this world, this shift, which is that Cambrian explosion of knowledge and of content. So as recently as 20 years ago, information, knowledge, content was scarce. Now, information, knowledge, and content is abundant. That is a radical shift. And in that shift, what makes for a good learner has actually radically changed. And so what you see is in that orange box, the primary motivation for why you learn something at work, if it was curiosity, it actually has a negative impact on the learning culture. Curious organizations have negative impact on their learning outcomes, learning objectives, learning culture. How can that be? How can curiosity be negatively correlated? Well, in a world where information was scarce, curiosity was the attribute that drove people, that was needed. It was the prerequisite to drive people far enough, hard enough to get the information they needed. But in a world where information is abundant, curiosity gets you on deep rabbit holes on Reddit. Now, as you look at this, what are the positive correlated attributes? And it's intentionality to be better in my current role and to be better for my next role. It's intentionality. In a world full of noise, you have to curate. In a world full of noise, you have to be very intentional. That is what now correlates with positive learning cultures. We've got to be intentional. You have to connect this to opportunity, to be better at my job, to be better at my next job. Going back to a bit of this Josh Bersin framework, the LMS evolved into the LXP, and the future is the Talent Academy. Well, what does this mean? What is a Talent Academy? Well, the evolution was e-learning, content libraries, micro-learning, short-form learning. Upskilling is hard. Upskilling is long. We actually went from micro-learning. So as you hear micro-learning, that's still requisite, but not sufficient. Now, as we solve upskilling, it's long-form programs. It takes, on average, 480 hours to learn a new skill. And these tend to be oriented by business need. This is, again, Josh Bersin work, which is what is the new technology stack? How are we going to build our organizations and our technologies and our platforms to accomplish this upskilling need that we're maturing into? Well, here's kind of, so employee access director via the skills, knowledge maturing into skills, into application, into experience. That's knowledge is really administered by the LXP. Skills and application is your talent academies, and experience is talent marketplaces. How do you map that back to job roles? And so you're seeing maturity in the market begin to emerge, and a lot of things kind of sit under all of that. So in understanding this problem, that's really what LearnIn has oriented to. That is our mission, is to help upskill the world at scale. We have spent the last 2.5 years understanding this problem, talking to now literally hundreds of enterprise organizations to see what is the need, what are the puzzle pieces we have to bring together a successful talent academy inside of organizations. And these are, so first, our definition of talent academy, talent is your workforce. The academy is the place for the upskilling, the place to develop a skilled workforce aligned to your needs. And the two biggest barriers being time and money. It was important that we unlock those. We have to talk about where is the funding, where are the dollars coming from? We have to talk about where is time being allocated. Then, how are you going to upskill? And we've come to distinguish two very unique use cases, which is sort of subscale and at scale. If you need to upskill one person, you should really outsource it. If you need to upskill 7 people, you should outsource it. If you need to upskill 70 people or 7,000 people, you have to bring that inside your organization. And so finding the right program, whether that's external or building a program internally, creating the right pathways through the organization. And then there has to be accountability, transparency, metricing, as we are committing to more time, more money against upskilling. Practically, this translates into 2 products for at LearnIn. So we've built 2 products. So the first is a skill marketplace that ties into your tuition assistance or an L&D budget. So this is when you need to outsource. This is when you have diverse needs across individuals. One person needs to learn data science. Another person needs to learn Salesforce administration. Another person needs to learn R. Another person needs to learn JavaScript. Another person needs to learn supply chain. You can, we've brought the world's best programs, short form, meaning 3 to 6 to 9 months. So shorter than a traditional degree, but this is not micro learning. This isn't an article, video, book, podcast. These are skill-based, kind of targeted programs. And then you pay for that, connecting to whatever budget you want to tie into, your tuition assistance, your L&D budget, or a line of business budget, but it empowers people to unlock their programs directly. And then on the other side is our at scale solution, our academy builder. When you need to upskill 700, 7,000 people, you need to bring that internally. And we have built the Talent Academy builder to help you build that internally, administer that, run a successful talent academy with great skill outcomes. How can you, what does this all turn into? Our logo is a propeller. It's inspired by Amelia Earhart's journey to be the first to cross the chasm. We're inspired. We think of the skills gap as this chasm that we have to cross. But Learn-In is like flight control for skill building everyone at scale. So that is my presentation that I have for you guys today. Hope that was useful. Hope that some of those research, some of those numbers were illuminating, eye-opening, and a bit to see the world in kind of a new lens.
Terrific, David. Thank you so much. We've got about 3 minutes before your colleague cafe. So if you folks are interested in spending another 15 minutes or so asking David some questions or offering your own comments, you can do that by clicking on the colleague cafe link below your player. But a couple of questions did come in during the course of the presentation, David, so I'll try to get to those now. Lynn in the audience asked a question that I think you touched on when you talked about your marathon analogy. So sort of how you define upskilling as opposed to perhaps learning. I like the way that you talked about just learning about marathoning isn't quite the same thing as doing it. So maybe talk a little bit more about what your definition of upskilling is and perhaps provide some examples based on different types of work.
Yeah. Maybe the more additive thing here would be to talk about the history of corporate learning as it relates to that question, which is the first corporate university, Crotonville, GE Crotonville. And that was a world where a long distance phone call was ungodly expensive before fax machines. And so the first corporate university was this physical place where GE was flying managers from around the world back to physical place to train them in the GE way. It was about management and about physical. I mean, it was just in a world where we still had to do a lot of things physically and then send them back out into the world to be good GE managers. And then sort of the second iteration of the corporate university really came as we began to get fax machines. We began to get CD-ROMs. We began to get the early internet. And all of a sudden, we could disseminate. We didn't have to physically fly someone back to New York to train them. We could disseminate information. Now, I promise you, you can't upskill someone by fax. I promise you, you can't upskill someone by CD-ROM. But you can disseminate knowledge and information. And so, and that lasted for, more than 15 years, its own evolution, the own evolution of knowledge dissemination. As we did go from fax to CD-ROM to on-premise to cloud-based to consumer ubiquitous internet. But now, again, you can't bits and bytes don't add up to upskilling. Upskilling has to be applied. Upskilling has to be contextualized. Upskilling is pretty damn hard, and it tends to require a lot of human intervention. And so that's just we're kind of what is old is new again. Like that tends to look a lot like kind of our university experience, where it was scaffolded, where there's teachers, where there was TAs, where we had coaching, where it was sequenced, where it was long, where it built and added up to things. And that's back where we're at. And so I think that's what the next kind of decade is going to begin to look like. Now there's a virtual aspect to that. But if you begin to rob it of any of those parts, the human, the intervention, the TA, the coaching, the scaffolding, the application, the contextualization, you start to pull, it's something less than upskilling. So we've got to kind of question, what can we do virtually? What has to happen in person? But it's big.